Hi, this is Kurt Gowdy. I'm sitting around here at camp after a very enjoyable day of hunting with Fred Bear, considered by most people the greatest archer hunter in America, also marvelous with a gun. I first met Fred through television outdoor series. Watched him in operation, have been with him. We struck up quite a friendship, and we hunt and fish together now. Fred, I know you've been all over the world. How'd you ever get started with your love for hunting?
Well, my father was a hunter. I grew up in a farm in Pennsylvania. My father was a hunter, and he had me shooting a gun when I was 6 years old.
This happens a lot of times. The father gets the boy interested, and it continues through the family.
It's a great combination, yes.
Well, you've hunted now over 40 years with a bow and arrow, with a gun, and I imagine all over the world you've had some exciting things happen to you. You've probably had some close escapes. You've had a lot of wild incidents. You probably had some funny things. I'll bet you can really tell some stories.
Well, I've had some very interesting experiences, yes. Many of them. Some of them could have ended tragically. Fortunately, they didn't. Some of them ended rather humorously. I've been charged twice by polar bears. The Eskimo had to gun them down. I spent a night in a wet night, a wet, cold night in a tree with a grizzly bear wolfing down around the bottom. But I think the most interesting experience I had that could have turned out tragically was hunting black bears in Alaska with a friend of mine named Bob Munger. Well, actually, I wasn't hunting. I was doing photography. We were making a film, and Bob was hunting with a bow and arrow. It was in the spring of the year, and we had worked ourselves up onto a flat tundra lake area that was very flat, except that a little hammock here and there with some trees growing out of it. And we saw in one of these little clusters of trees a moose. We did a very good Indian sneaking job on him and get up to a good picture range, and I took quite a few pictures, and finally I had all I wanted. And normally, I like to sneak out in a case like that and take a little pride in having been able to do it without the animal seeing me, but in this case, Bob stood up and he waved his arms and yelled. He wanted to see the moose run off, but what we didn't know was this cow moose had a calf. And cow moose, when they have a calf, are sometimes dangerous, and this one took off after us. Well, my legs were a little longer than Bob's, and I quickly got the lead, and we were running through this soft tundra, shedding cameras and bows and arrows and whatnot. And about 200 yards away was a little hillock with one lone tree growing out of it that was not big enough for the two of us, and I got there first and laid claim to it. There had been another tree there that had died and blown over with the roots sticking up in the air, and there was a hole underneath it. So I yelled to Bob to duck in the hole, which he did. And when he was in the hole, the moose paid no attention to him, came over to the tree I was on, began bumping it with her shoulder. But I was high enough. Well, about that time, Bob was out of the hole, and the moose saw him and took him for a turn around the tree, and then he ducked back in the hole. And I couldn't understand why he didn't stay in there, but the moose came back to the tree then again, and then Bob was out of the hole again. And
kept ducking in and out of the hole.
Kept ducking in and out of the hole, yeah. And it didn't make sense, but he started off across the tundra, and I yelled to him. I said, "What's the matter with your head? Get in the hole and stay there." And he said, "I can't. There's a bear in there."
Oh, what a situation.
Yep.
I've seen you hunt polar bear. I saw a great show you shot in Alaska on the polar bear and the American Sportsman. And to me, it's amazing, that big white bear and that white ice floes up there, and you were all in white hood and coat to use as your camouflage, and how you killed that polar bear with a bow and arrow. When did you really get interested in bow and arrow hunting for big game?
When did I get interested?
Yes.
As I told you, I learned to hunt with my father with a gun. And I hunted that way for about 20 years. And then I got interested in the bow and arrow. I killed the largest deer I ever saw or really heard of with a gun, and it was really kind of easy, and I decided I wanted a little harder way, so I took up the bow and arrow. And that's the way I got into the bow business. Yes, the polar bear is a magnificent animal. All bears have great dignity.
They do, you're right.
They have great dignity.
That's a good word.
And if you know that, you can escape trouble a lot of times. If you push a bear a little bit too much, then he may come at you. But if you just hesitate just a minute to allow a dignified retreat, you're not in trouble anymore. But there's one thing about bear hunting. First place, you shouldn't shoot female bears with cubs. And if you do mess around with them, then is when you're apt to get in trouble. The boar bear will rarely give you any trouble. He hasn't any cubs to protect. He's strictly on his own, and he's only interested in saving his skin. But the female bears are the ones that give you the trouble. The polar bear, I have great respect for. He can, out on that bleak ice pack, make himself a pretty good living. And he does it mostly by catching seals. And the seal will lie out in the sun by a hole, by an escape hole, with his nose right on it. And his head is up, looking around about 15 seconds out of every minute. He catnaps, so to speak, or seal naps.
He knows he's in danger.
He knows he's in danger, yes. And his head is up once a minute, and he scans the horizon, and it's down again.
Like the old, when the geese come into the cornfield, there's always one of them with his head looking around, and he's going to warn the others.
Yeah, but if there are a dozen seals in an area, they all have their heads up. Well, anyhow, the polar bear has to be a great hunter, and he must, with all his bulk and size, and with his black nose and black eyes and black claws, must sneak up close enough to spring on that seal before he can get down the hole, and that takes a lot of doing. The polar bear is a great hunter. He's the best hunter of all the animals I know of.
He really is.
Oh,
I wouldn't think that. He's so big and cumbersome, you'd think. Of course, I guess with a white body against the white snow, he must be stealthy and quiet, huh?
Well, the Eskimos say, they have the black nose, which is a giveaway. Mm-hmm. The Eskimos say in this sneak, which I've never seen, that they will cover their black nose with their paw so that the seals can't see them. That's a little hard to believe, but it could be possible. I don't know.
Fred, and you're hunting in North America. I know you love to hunt the white-tailed deer. Why?
Well, the white-tailed deer, in my opinion, is the smartest game animal that there is today.
That's going to surprise a lot of people.
Well, I say this, that anyone who can successfully hunt the white-tailed deer is qualified to hunt any animal. And the only difference in the hunting technique is brought about by the terrain, not the animal. Really, the sheep is supposed to be an exotic animal, and it is. Mm-hmm. And he's supposed to be real smart.
High altitude, rocky crags.
He is tough to get to, but he doesn't have the mental capacity that the white-tailed deer has. You must remember that the sheep is lying up on the side of a mountain, and he can see all around. But he can be approached from above very easily. His ears are not as good. His nose isn't as good. His eyes are excellent. They're probably beyond the white-tailed deer. But he can be approached. The only difference is the physical exertion to climb up to where he is. That's where the secret of sheep hunting. But actually, if you put a white-tailed deer up in that same position, he would be harder to approach than the sheep is.
He's that smart.
Yeah. See, the white-tailed deer can live near civilization. He can live. I have a buck living within 100 yards of my home in Grayling. And he's been there all during this deer season that's just now closing, and the hunters are running all over the woods. They won't hunt close to town because there can't be anything there, in their opinion. But this deer is smart enough to stick close to my house, and he's going to avoid the hunters, and he's going to live through the winter.
Well, what are your tips to hunt white-tailed deer, then, if they're so smart?
Well, to hunt them with a bow, and also to hunt them with a gun. First, you must remember, in hunting with a bow, in most states, there is a separate earlier season to hunt with a bow and arrow. So that makes the hunting technique a little bit different than in the later gunning season, when the weather's different and when there are more hunters. In the bow season, there aren't too many hunters around, and the deer are pursuing their natural habits. They're walking trails, and they're going to a feeding ground, returning from it, and going to a bedding ground at approximately the same times. Not the same times every day, because that varies too. A deer is, well, all animals. Their movements are governed by their stomach, by food and water. Many people think that a deer will, most of them feed at night, or they do most of their feeding at night. They think they go out and feed all night, and then they go to a bedding area and bed down all night, or all day. Well, this is not so. In the feeding ground at night, they are up and down, and the cycle is roughly about 2 hours. They fill their stomach, and they digest it, and they're up filling it again. The same is true in the daytime when they're in the so-called bedding grounds. And the bedding grounds are thicker cover. They go in there for safety. They have learned from their association with man that he's not ramming around the woods at night. But in the daytime he is, and they better get in the thickest cover that they can. You can intercept these deer, and one of the ways that the archers do it is to find a runway or trail that might look like a cow path. And they build a blind along it, not too far away. The blind has to be maybe 20 yards, 25 yards away from the trail, and downwind, of course, because the deer have a very powerful nose. The blind is built like you'd build a duck blind, with brush stuck up or logs or whatever material is available. You don't import any foreign material because the deer would see it. The blind has to be large enough so you can swing the bow, and the bow requires a lot more room than a gun, because you have to push it out at arm's length and then you have to draw it back. The blind should be built low. In other words, don't fence yourself in and depend on looking through holes. The blind is to cover the lower part of the body, and the head should have you should have a good view, because it's important in all hunting to see your game first. That's one of the methods of hunting the white-tailed deer. And the blind hunting is good from daylight for about 2 hours and the last 2 hours in the evening, because that is when deer are normally moving from the bedding ground to the feeding ground, or vice versa. During the remainder of the day, during the middle part of the day, and here is an instance where hunters don't quite understand all the time. They think that during the middle part of the day, that's the time you should go to camp or go home for lunch or take a nap. Really, you go into the bedding areas, and deer move about during that time. They don't go over to the feed ground. They move about and nip on grass or whatever food there is available during this middle part of the day. And it's to get a deer, you have to try and approach him when he's on foot. If he's lying down, it's pretty tough. They're hard to see. They're in the brush, and they will face downwind, so they can see you coming. If you're coming upwind.
About the wind, the children in this country have read about sneaking up with into the wind all the time, not at your back. This means something, right?
Well, yes, and it means something, and the deer know that. Actually, the deer think you can smell them, too. You must remember that, always. All animals, they can smell you, so they think you can smell them. Well, they watch downwind, and you're coming upwind. Actually, crosswind is a better way to hunt.
Crosswind?
Crosswind is a better way to hunt, yes. You have a little bit of an advantage there. Now, how to hunt other than the blind? Well, on a blind, of course, you build it and you sit there, and you have to sit quietly. You try to make your blind as comfortable as possible so you won't have to move around too much. And you just sit there and wait for a deer to come along. Now, that is not the most exciting way, but it is the most productive way to get a deer. The kind of hunting that I like, and the kind that is exciting, is known as still hunting, which simply means that you sneak around in the woods until you see an animal. And in the case of a gun, when you see it, you are usually close enough for a shot. But that's not true with the bow. When you see, let's say, a deer, you're faced with the problem of getting close enough to it for the bow and arrow. And the bow and arrow range is 20 to 30 yards. Now, many animals are killed at great distances a great deal larger than that, but The effective range of the bow, if you want to place your arrow where it should be, is 20 to 30 yards. And what you're doing, when you're still hunting, you're invading the domain of the deer. This is his home. He knows every path. He knows every tree, practically every leaf. And you don't. You're a stranger.
And he has superb senses.
Oh, yes, and it's very difficult. The nose is the worst factor. The nose will give you away more times than the eyes and the ears put together.
Their scent.
Oh, yes, yeah. And unless the wind is blowing strong, it can circle around, and very frequently does, in the woods, over the side of the hill or down in the pocket. You go down in the pocket, and the wind's blowing one direction. You get down in there, and it's swirling around in a circle, so you have many problems there. But really, Kurt, before you go hunting, now let's say you're going to go up to Michigan to hunt, or to New York or Maine or wherever you're going. You don't know the country, but you want to go up there and hunt deer. Well, you just don't go up there and park your car and start off hunting because there's some trees there. In every area of any size where there are deer, there are certain places in that area where there are more deer. And there are places in that area where there are no deer. And you have to find out, naturally, if you hunt in the area where the most deer are, your chances of success are going to be greater. So it's hard to find where that area is. And how do you do it? Well, you ask questions of local people. You don't ask one question of one person and then do what he says. You take a cross-section and sort of try to sift the facts out of the information that you get. That helps. You travel about the country, in your car, if you like, on the old trails, and look for tracks and look for signs. You can see runways that are many times cut into the earth. Don't be taken in by the mere fact you've found a runway, however, because that may have been a good spot last year and is not a good spot this year. Maybe last year there were no acorns and the deer were feeding along the edge of the swamp. Maybe this year there are acorns and they've moved over to where the oak trees are, and there won't be a deer on this runway once a week. So you find runways. In other words, you find evidence, and the evidence is in the form of tracks, fresh tracks, not old tracks. And when you find the greatest concentration of tracks, then that's the place to hunt.
There's some preparation of this, then.
Well, yes, it's like anything else. You simply have to use your head. Animals employ no magic. They just are governed by their senses, and they can be figured out in most cases, although when you get to a point where you think you're so good that you know what a deer will do, then your head has gotten a little too big for your hat, because that's the time they're going to do the opposite thing. So I never try to predict what a deer is going to do. I try to play the averages, and that's what you have to do when you're hunting. Actually, in my experience with a bow, the white-tailed deer is the hardest to kill. Very rarely do you see the picture book deer. Very rarely do you see the whole deer standing out in the open. As a general rule, you will, and it's important to see the deer before he sees you. That's a must. You practically have to see him before he sees you. Otherwise, he's alerted and he's watching for you, and you will never get close. You look for parts of a deer. You look for, in the woods, let's say, a horizontal line that could be a fallen log, except that it tapers off to a rounded back. Now, you can train your eyes, or your eyes, I should say, become trained after a certain amount of experience in the woods to bypass any horizontal line that's longer than a deer. Your eye doesn't dwell on it at all. You just pass it by. You look for an ear, a little off-color spot, maybe the tip of an antler, maybe the white of the inside of the legs. In the case of a whitetail, I've seen many deer by seeing just the white V of their tail. The underneath part of their tail is white, and a few white hairs stick out the side to give you a white V. You never look for the whole deer. Your progress in the woods when you're doing this still hunting, which is merely sneaking around as quietly as possible, when you're in cover where you can go quietly, you go very slowly. When you're in cover where it's not possible to go quietly, when there are a lot of leaves on the ground, let's say dry leaves, or when you have to cross an opening, you get it over with. If you're going through noisy cover, the best thing to do is to just barge right through and get it over with until you get into cover where it's quieter walking. The same is true with an opening. You get it over with. You should not walk through openings when you're hunting. In mountainous country, you should not walk the skyline because your silhouette can be seen by everything within eye range. You usually walk game trails. Two reasons for this. That's where you're more likely to see a deer, and that's where the footing will be more quiet. You can usually go the direction you want on a game trail by just going until you find one that goes in that direction. And the whole country is covered with game trails if there are game in the area. Hunting technique varies in your eastern and northeastern states, which includes some of the states of the Midwest. You're hunting in country that isn't mountainous and is usually rather thickly covered. There's lots of trees. When you get out in the western part of the country, beyond the Mississippi and out in the whole Southwest, where you have plains and mountains, then your hunting technique varies. In dry country, your water becomes almost important, or maybe more important in the eyes of the hunter than the food situation, because game has to have water. For instance, in hunting antelope, when I first went hunting antelope, they told me out in your hometown, by the way, Cheyenne, isn't it? Mm-hmm. That there's something wrong with my head. You can't get close enough to the antelope. Well, I found out differently. All I did was build a blind, like we spoke about, at a water hole and waited for them to come in. I also found that you can't get close enough to an antelope with a bow and arrow in the open plains country, but there are always rough areas, broken up ridges and whatnot, adjacent to these where you can do a very good job of still hunting and sneak shooting the antelope. So you have to adapt yourself to the terrain, and you have to also remember that technique only varies with the type of country you're hunting in.
You know, when you're stalking a deer which is feeding, a lot of fellows watch their tail. Why?
Well, we'll have to go back to the female deer, the doe. Sometime that May or June, she has given birth to one or two or maybe three fawns. She is the guardian. She is the sentinel. She is the outpost. It's up to her to be alert to all dangers. It's up to her to observe a fox or a coyote or a wolf or a cougar or whatever it is that might be sneaking up to get one of these little fawns. And one of the signals that she employs to talk to the fawns, and a signal that all white-tailed deer use, are with their tail. And they have the various kind of signals. They'll put the tail up when they're alerting the group to danger. And that tail will be up as long as she is concerned. And the all well signal is a horizontal wave of the flag. And when she does that, then everything's fine. All the deer are off the alert. The siren's not blowing anymore, and they're back to feeding and minding their own business. And many times, one of the things you have to do when you're sneaking on a deer, to get within bow range, you must see that deer's head at all times. If you don't see it at all times, if you go behind a bush and sneak up, the deer might be looking at you and seeing you now. And a deer, if it's alarmed, if you make a little noise, or if the deer thinks he saw a movement, he will stand motionless up to 10 or 15 minutes. He won't move an eyebrow. He has patience, and you have to have just a little more than he has. because you're standing there and you have to let him decide whether he has in his own mind seen something that's a danger, or whether he has just a flick of his, maybe a wing of a bird that he had observed. And if he decides that's the case, then he'll forget entirely about you. He'll forget completely. One thing you have to remember, animals have very poor memory. You have to remember this also. Your eyesight is up 5 or 6 feet above the floor of the forest. Now, deer's eyesight is only about, or his eye level is only about 2 feet up. And they can see under a lot of branches that you think are covering you. It's like the ostrich sticking his head in the sand, you know. His eyes are covered, but the whole rest is sticking out.
How about your aim? Where do you aim with an arrow?
Well, we aim in the low shoulder or just behind it. The heart or lungs are the best place to hit with an arrow.
But you were talking about the range for a bow and arrow is 20 or 30 yards. I'd like to frankly talk to you about bow hunting. There's arguments for it and against it. You presented a challenge. It seems to be the most challenging. To get within 20 or 30 yards is a great challenge to the hunter. You can shoot game quarter of a mile away, 200 or 300, 400 yards. That doesn't take the skill of stalking a game and getting as close, right? So there's more challenge in getting close to the game in bow and arrow hunting. Mm-hmm.
And when you take up the bow for hunting, you're assuming quite a handicap, because you do have to get close. And the closer you get, the greater your chances are of being seen by the deer, let's say.
Fred, today when we were hunting, we were using one of the blinds that you'd built. Most of your experiences in hunting and the fellows you hunt with, do they hunt deer from blinds?
Well, most of them do, early morning and late evening, and they still hunt in between, which is the way I like to do it, although I don't, I'm good for about an hour in the blind, and I get a little restless, and I want to see what's over the hill.
You want to get moving, huh?
Yeah, I like to get going.
You were talking a little bit earlier about letting an animal walk slightly past you before shooting. Why?
Well, you see, here again, that's not so important with a gun, because you, with a gun, you just very slowly can raise it and shoot. But with the bow, you've got to push the bow out at arm's length, stick it up in the air, and go through a lot of motions of drawing. So your chances are a lot better if you wait till the deer's past you. Then he's not so apt to see you. But don't be fooled on the angle of sight of a deer. From a side view, I don't know what the angle might be, but they can see back quite a ways. And even though they are past you, you have to make your movements very slow and deliberate. Then there's another reason for doing that. An arrow going forward from behind the front legs is a much better hit, because you're getting into the vital areas. So there are two reasons for that.
How do you train yourself to concentrate on a tiny spot? You want to really split a hair, don't you? How do you do this?
Well, it's the worst thing you can do with a gun or a bow is to shoot at the whole deer. You'll miss it. You concentrate on the very smallest spot that you want to hit. You don't look at anything else. You don't look at the antlers, if they have any, or the eyes, or any of the rest of the deer. You only see that little spot there back of the shoulder.
This is like shooting a covey of quail.
Same thing. And, you know, at 20 yards, an average bow hunter, let's say, couldn't hit a tin can. But he'll miss a deer. And the difference is because he's shooting at the whole animal, and the buck fever's probably entered into it. Now, getting into the buck fever business, with a gun, you get buck fever. And maybe the deer is 100 yards. Well, think how much greater the chances are of getting buck fever when you're hunting with a bow if the deer's only 20 yards, or 10 or 15, when you could see every whisker on his nose and see his eyelashes. A buck fever really grabs you at that time, and it does things that are amazing. And it seems more reasonable to get buck fever over a bear, or bear fever if you want to call it, because they are potentially dangerous. But the deer can really get your heart pounding and get your blood racing around through the veins. When I first started hunting, I got buck fever. I was afraid the deer would hear my heart beating and scare them away. Yes, I've been...
Just Pounds
Just
and
pound.
pounds
Yeah.
and pounds. You think
Yeah.
it can be heard all over?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that brings on that condition is you're inclined to not breathe normally. You're inclined to not breathe deeply. And I think your system gets partly drained of oxygen and encourages the tremors that are associated with the so-called buck fever.
I've seen you shoot moving targets. Have you ever shot a moving animal with a bow and arrow
Oh,
when he's on a
yes,
run?
many, many. Uh, to shoot a moving animal with a bow is strictly instinctive, like duck shooting or trap shooting. You swing on your lead, and by practice, you're able to do it pretty well. Although the velocity on an arrow is much lower. A running deer at 40 yards, you've got to lead him about 3 jumps. And in my own particular case, I can't say this applies to anybody else's technique, but I have a mental picture of the flight of the arrow before I loose it. And I have a mental picture of the deer coming, and I can see them meeting in my eye before I loose the arrow.
Is there a little tip of shooting with noises? Do you have any little tips on that?
Yes. One of the greatest problems of the bow hunter, I'm speaking of just bows now, is that the bowstring, the twang of the bowstring, seems to be the most terrifying sound in the woods to a deer.
It's an alarming noise to them.
Oh, it really frightens them. And sound travels about, let's say, 1,100 feet a second, but your arrow's poking along at less than 200. So the deer hears the sound of the bowstring, and he has a built-in involuntary muscular reaction to strange sounds. And many times, in a well-directed arrow, he will not be there when the arrow gets there. Matter of fact, I've killed 3 deer that I hit on the opposite side from I shot at. They heard the bowstring and turned around a half turn before the arrow got there. And it's really maddening. You'll do a beautiful jog on a stock. You'll get up close enough to them. You'll shoot a good arrow, but the deer won't be there. Sometimes you can correct for that. If it's stormy, you might time your shot when a gust is blowing the leaves and making noise around. Once I timed my shot with a woodsman's axe. A woodsman was cutting a tree about a couple hundred yards from where I was, and I could time it with him. Other times, maybe you can time it with a passing car if you're near a highway, or if it's raining, then there are noises in the woods that sometimes will give you a little cover-up for the sound of your bowstring.
You know, you can really get a fellow enthused about this bow and arrow hunting. I can see the challenges of it now. It's more difficult. I can see the thrill of it. You have to stalk better. You have to get closer. It seems to be much more sporting. What about the equipment? I mean, should the bow be as tall as I am? Or do you have to be a strong person? Can anybody use a bow and arrow?
Well, yes. My dad took up archery at the age of 65 and killed his first deer with a bow at the age of 68. So it's an all-family type of sport. It used to be, when I first began archery, that you had to use a real heavy bow for hunting. You had to use a bow so heavy that you had to work out on it like a weightlifter to build yourself up to it. Equipment is, the modern archery equipment is much more efficient now. And the average person can shoot a hunting weight bow. In other words, a bow of, let's say, 45 pounds today will outshoot a 60-pound bow of yesterday. But you have to still remember one thing. The muscles used to shoot a bow are muscles that are not developed. They're back muscles, really. And if you're interested in archery, this thing you have to do is to start with a lightweight bow, maybe not an expensive bow around 35 pounds.
About 35 pounds.
Yeah. And even that bow will feel heavy to you. And then you progress to the heavier weight bows. You never learn to shoot a heavy bow by shooting a light bow. You have to get the heavier bow and work out on it, like Milo carrying a calf around the barn, you know. He kept carrying it, and the calf grew into a cow, and he could still carry it. It's a weightlifting principle. You break a muscle down to build it up. You make a muscle tired, and then it comes back stronger.
How about the length of the bow?
Well, it used to be, in the days of the wood bow, that a bow should be as tall as you are. But that's not true anymore. Fiberglass has given us a material that you can shoot a bow half as tall as you are, and it'd still be a safe, efficient bow.
Is this the best material we've ever found for a bow, fiberglass?
Oh, yes, yes. See, fiberglass has no fatigue. It always comes back to its original position. It has no fatigue, and it's very tough, and the length of the bow is not determined. To state it in simple words, you use a long bow for tournament shooting or for practice or for recreation. And for hunting, you get a shorter bow because it's easier to get around with in the woods.
What about the importance of practicing, getting started in this, and then you're good enough to go out and go on an actual trip to hunt game? Should you practice before you go?
Well, the difference between a bow and a gun is this. You might buy a gun. You might buy your first gun the day before you went hunting and go out the next day and shoot a deer with it, because the business of shooting a gun is relatively simple. The fellow that manufactured the gun did most of the job. You simply have to point it and pull the trigger. That's not so with the bow and arrow. If you're going to take up archery or bow hunting seriously, you should begin in the spring, or 4 or 5 months before you're actually going to go hunting. And yes, practice and learn the technique of shooting a bow. Another thing that many bow hunters do not do, it is important, in my opinion, and I do it, it is important to practice during a hunt, not when you're sneaking around expecting to see a deer, but at times when you're having lunch or when you have a group talking together. You should carry, all hunters should carry, several blunt arrows, and that's an arrow with a blunt head that can be shot into a tree or stump or leaf or anything. And you should practice, because the first shot that you get at hunting is the important shot. And maybe if you haven't shot an arrow for 3 or 4 days, that might be the worst arrow you ever released, so you should keep yourself in shape. You should get those first bad shots out of your system by practicing.
You know, Fred, you know what a nut I am on fishing. You ever fish with a bow and arrow?
Yes, we shoot rough fish. That's real sporting. Carp and suckers and gar, and we don't shoot game fish. And we have a real heavy arrow. It's a solid fiberglass arrow with a harpoon-type point and a line attached to it, and a reel that feeds the line off the end like a spinning reel. And strangely, we can get down in 12, 15 feet of water and get a fish. You know, you try to shoot a bullet in the water and you get nowhere. But because of our slower velocity and heavy arrow weight, we can go right down in. It's great fun. You get a 30 or 40-pound carp on the end of a line, and you're pretty busy for a little while.
What about the illusion of the sighting through the water?
Yeah, well, it's the refraction. You have to aim, depending on the angle of your shot, you have to aim always below the fish. And how far below depends on the angle and the depth of the water. But there again, you get real good at it from experience, and you can estimate. You might aim even 1.5 feet below the fish to hit the fish.
Fred, here you are. You've hunted 40 years now with a gun, with a bow and arrow, your own marvelous bow and arrow equipment. You've been all over the world. You've hunted just about every kind of game. You've stalked elephant, lions, tigers, polar bear, deer. You've been within 15, 20 yards of the most dangerous game in the world. You've been everywhere. You've been with some of the most famous guides and hunters in the world. What's the biggest thrill that you've ever had out of hunting?
Well, I think I could answer that best by calling attention to the film you made sometime back, which I saw. You took your boys, your eastern boys, out to Wyoming, your home territory.
Right.
Took them out in the trout stream where you caught trout when you're a barefoot boy.
Same stream my dad started me as a boy.
Well, I looked at that, and it just made me think. Really, when you talk about great trophies and being many places in the world and being with wonderful outfitters, when it's all boiled down, really, the kill is an anticlimax. It's something that while you are hunting, and you are hunting for a purpose to get a kill, the real fun of the thing is the companionship, the talks around a campfire like we're doing right now. And to observe nature, the birds and the animals, and to see the fish, and to find different kind of plants and study different kind of trees. That's really the thrill of the thing, and the hunting is secondary. And to me, one of the greatest sights that I can think of is to see a father take his son or sons, like you did, out into the woods and give them a good understanding of nature. It's important to get them off the streets, and there isn't anything that will cleanse the soul like getting up on a good frosty morning and washing your face in a creek where you have to break the ice. And really, if some of our teenage thrill seekers really want to go out and get a thrill, let them go up into the Northwest and tangle with a grizzly bear, a polar bear, and a brown bear. They'll get their thrills that way.
I agree with you. Hey, listen, we could talk here all night. We've got to go hunting in the morning. What do you say we hit the sack?
Good idea.